All right, fantastic. You're still with me. All right, so we have our DHCP running. I'm not going to do the checks yet, but we'll show you those log screens here in a minute. But I mentioned we're going to talk about DNS. So the first thing is that we created the server definitions when we created the Sapphire option. When we look at these particular options, there are some tabs for configurations, such as logging. You'll have then various options that we'll go through and set up. And then you have in those options various allow policies. So this is going to be kind of the chicken and the egg. We need to go through the policy setup first and or come back and edit this. So we're going to go ahead and do the policies first and do this in order. The first one of those is that we're going to do the address match list, because this is where you're going to define who can do what from a server or client perspective at a DNS level. We typically want to set up some type of things like internal DNS resolvers. And we'll say that these are our secondary DNS servers and their IPs. Now, this is one way of doing it. So we support, well, click on the add to match list, and this gives us what we're going to match against. Now, I have these two servers here, and I'm going to just go ahead and do 10.10.0.3, submit. I can do another if I want to do this. This might also be where you want to put your AD servers if you want them to allow to do any type of updating or transferring, etc. Other options that you'll see here are going to be net service pairs. So I can say that these two DNS servers are paired together, or that they're in this list. And that would include their IP addresses, which is somewhat redundant in this particular view, but I just want to show you the different types. Now, we also support TSIG, but I'll show a different way of supporting that as well. So I'm going to just remove these here. We'll go ahead and submit that, and we'll keep that there. And then we're going to add one more for allow dynamic updates. Who can dynamically update DNS? And here, again, if we have a specific range of IP addresses or servers or net services that we want to enable, we would set those here. And I'm going to go ahead and set my DHCP, and we'll just use the net service for those two servers. And then I'm going to add in my IPControl executive, 10.10.0.2. And then I'm going to add in maybe, let's see, some other clients here. See, anything on my management subnet that might be able to do that. So that's, a good update policy. Right, and then I think we should be able to go ahead and do the logging channels. So let's go ahead and do those first. So Bind DNS provides logging effectively for every type of query, transfer, update, and different methods of each. So here you want to basically set up a list of different types of logging channels to capture that detail for troubleshooting, or for syslog, or for other forwarding. So I typically will end up doing a default, which we're going to set for pretty much everything, and then tell it this file, and we'll tell it to use the log directory, and we'll do DNS-default log. We want this to have 10 versions, and we're going to do 10 meg each. We need to have M. File suffix, none. We're going to do let's do informational on this. And then the rest of this, we definitely want to do buffering. So Bind 918 supports buffering and allows us to do faster queries, because if you have a lot of log and a lot of FIFO in and out, that you're going to have some slower queries. Buffering allows us to mitigate some of that. Let's do a couple more here real quick. Let's do query. Again, dist file, opt, and control, log, DNS queries, log, 10M. And again, informational and buffering. Definitely buffering on this. And then let's just do transfers here. We would, you might do transfer in, transfer out. So let's do that. Exfer in for the secondaries. And under informational again, buffering, yes. And let's do transfer out. Okay, last one. Okay, just for now, we'll capture that, and you would continue to do this for each of these, and I recommend others as well that we would go through, but we'll start with that. Now, on your DNS servers, to activate those logging channels, we then would go into the particular categories and select those channels. So here, I'm just going to do a couple here where we would do defaults, configuration, default, default. Dynamic updates, we would come back and create a log for it. Inbound transfers, we'll go ahead and use X for N. General, let's do default. Notify, we'll do X for N being the notify in. Outbound. Then our queries. And then again, we would do others for other channels, which we'll come back and do in another video for RPZ, dynamic DNS, and some other changes here. Okay, so that's what we want there. Now, I won't go over this much, but the start extensions has the ability to paste bind named syntax correct syntax. So you can copy basically anything to the named config, whether zone config, other options, etc. Now, the root hints, and typically the way that we deploy DNS is a tiered structure. When you have a resolver, we don't recommend that you have that same resolver for your internal domains talk to internet domain name servers and following referrals. We would highly recommend that you have a isolated layer strictly for DNS forwarding, and those forwarding servers talk to either your umbrella or other external root servers. So for that purpose, we would recommend putting in a separate layer. Only for this evaluation, will we create the root file so that we have some level of internet resolution for validation. Now the zones are none there, but when we add those, we'll see it. And then the RNDC channels, where we allow for different messages to come from, and we'll use the defaults and the RNDC keys. Now the options we want to set up, and that's going to allow for maybe controlling things like the allow notify, which I don't need at this point, but allow a query, we would definitely want to set that to any, being any, and any for this, and then allow query, allow recursion any, and allow transfer. We want to do perhaps our transfer, internal DNS resolvers. And we further want to go down to, say, check names. And we'll do check names master, ignore. So if we have underscores things, we'll have that, resolver, slaves, and go from that. And then DNSSEC validation, because we're really, they can do validation, but we're going to tell it to turn off because they're talking to the root servers. If we had to forward to another layer and these could not directly talk to root to validate the DNSSEC and validate all the way down to the referral, meaning every server that we go to a zone, then it would fail. And obviously that's not what this is intended to do. So usually set that to validation no internally unless you have that layer already defined. And we'll go ahead and set that. And we'll do empty forwarders because we're going to do some forwarding at some point. And we'll set that here. And we could set other information up in terms of like listening on and other types of details, query source and others, which we would normally, but I want to kind of move into this and get to the configuration more. So I'm going to just jump down to the bottom and look for our recursion. Yes. And then let's just go down here, zone stats, and enable that. Okay. And that'll be our primary, and then this will be our secondary. And normally you wouldn't have your primary doing those types of options. And again, we'll go over this maybe architecturally in some other documents here and cover that. I'm going to set the options on these real quick as well. Now this also, I guess we could have set up in the template, predefined these, which is always a good idea. So if you know what those options are ahead of time, before you create the appliance, you could modify that template and we could define these ahead of time. And that's highly recommended if we're going to do this with more than one server, multiple servers here. For cache any. All right, so give me just a minute, and I'm going to set these. Be right back. And with the magic of pause, we're back here with all of the options set, and I didn't put you through that boring action there. So here's what we have in just our basic setup. Now, some of these options are more advanced. We're going to come back to this with some DNS security, where we talk about DOH and DOT. But here we're just doing straight up DNS, and this is what we have. Now, lastly, you can set up here tags, and a tag within the appliance might be let's say DNS resolver to create a new one. Let's see. And now this tag can be used when we do DNS configuration deployments. So if you had different types of DNS secondaries, resolvers, or regional, you can do configuration deployments at different times or through tagging. And do stage updates as well through package updates, which we'll go through in a later video for software and bind and other options. And just real quick, let me do these one more minute. And we have all these now with our defaults. So we should be ready to go ahead and start to look at the zones and the configurations for delegation. Okay, so with this configuration, then we have this concept of zones, and I'm not going to really talk about this yet here, but there's various ways that DNS can be defined and configured in IPControl. First is by server. So within the DNS server, we often do this where we'll have all of the master zones or primary zones specifically defined on the server as a zone. So you would do add zone, and then this would be master in this regard. We would select the DNS domain, and this would create this DNS domain on this server explicitly. Well, I'm going to do something a little different here, and we may come back to this, but I want to use the Galaxies, which are our IPControl way of grouping together domains and DNS server profiles so that you can rapidly deploy new domains and configs and new servers or recover servers. So I want to go ahead and do here an internal Galaxy, since I'm going to have, internal servers and domains. And then I'm going to have external Galaxy. And we'll say external servers and domains. Now, with this concept, then we have profiles. And we're going to start with the internal here. Now, of note, with these profiles, we allow you then to go in and set up, and we're going to do bind Sapphire 918. We're going to select master, and then it's going to give us the ability to see all of the servers defined that have that version who are not already defined in another context. And we're going to go ahead and define this particular device here. However, what I wanted to point out here is there are a certain number of options that are applicable to a Galaxy. We don't explicitly allow everything. There's most. If there is something that you need that isn't part of this, you would typically design or add that zone at the server level for the master zones, but you would use a Galaxy for the slave zones or secondary zones, if that makes sense. So we're going to do this for all the primary, assuming that everything's going to work as is. And we're going to say this is our primary server. We're going to include this into the name server and the SOA of the zones, and it's going to use this record for it. However, I have the option to do hidden masters, and I could take an alternate name and make this the secondary server. And that would be set up in the SOA and also in the NS glue record. But we're going to just kind of follow the simplest way of doing this for now. No additional options, we're just going to add the server. Now we want to go back and we want to add a internal profile for our slaves. And again, this is also version specific. So as you migrate through different versions and servers with IPControl, you may have different Galaxies, and each one different options that are supported, and you can have multiples and move them between them as you upgrade, as we do. Here we give it a string for the master server, so we're going to do 10.10.0.3 is our master, and we want to tell it to generate the file name. We want the db.zone.com, or reverse domain, to be there. Now here we're going to add our secondary, which is the only one on the list, but again, any qualifying servers would be in this list. And we'll include the name server because we only have 2 here. No additional options. We basically want everything to be from a server level, but I could bypass it here and set these values explicitly. Now, at this point, we can go back and associate domains. So we have profiles, primary, secondary. Here are the domains, and I'm going to grab both of these. And that's it. Now, those 2 domains are now associated to these 2 servers in their different contexts, one being a master, one being a slave. And when we generate the configurations for those servers, they'll generate accordingly, which is what we're going to do right now. I'm going to go out and select our service. I'm going to generate to the primary first, all files. We're going to tell it to do DNS Update Manager, no, but we're going to do DNS Zone Check, stop on errors, and then check the config. And we could hold this for preview, which we will do like we did the DHCP. And you'll see firsthand. Now, I like to sort this a little differently too. So my latest task is on top. And again, if you want to change that fixed header, make this a little bit easier to read as you navigate to it. All right, so let's go clicking into the subtask. This will give you, as I mentioned, this will give you the information level. So this is a result code of the changes it did and how it's checked. And we'll see within each of the zones all of the values, the default A records that we created for those servers and their agents under their origins, and we effectively handle all of the config. All right. So I think we're safe to say we can deploy this and let this go out and run, and let's just see how everything goes. You may see me clicking this refresh. Somewhat of an impatient guy in my older age here. Fun to watch the spinning wheel. However, you can also click into these tasks if you want to see something complete there. So that's complete. We've got the transfer, everything's great. And that server should be running as a primary. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to deploy now the secondary DNS, which will be this system. And all I really need to do here is the configuration only, because this is just a config, and I'm not going to hold it. We'll just tell it to deploy, and we'll tell it to save it. I'm just going to watch the task just to see what happens. And then I'm going to jump into some shell stuff, and we're going to get nasty down into the configs, just for troubleshooting and understanding. And now, from a task perspective, to understand, there's 2 parts. While we're here, the task itself gets generated onto the executive, and it gets generated into the opt-in control temp directory. And in that opt-in control temp, there's a task that's in this system. So if we go take a look at the task here, so it generates it locally, it puts it into this FTP root, which is the default for the login user. It is told what task to grab, and in that task, it then knows, here's my DNS configuration file, and here are any zones zipped up, which it uncompresses and parses through. So all of that is done in the back end. It does it over an ActiveMQ notification or message and so on. So we got some errors here. It'd be good to look at, and let's see what we have in terms of data and why we might have failed. Our RNDC. So let's go take a look at this RNDC, make sure I had it set right. That's under advanced. Let's go ahead and tell it to listen on 127.0.0.1. We'll tell it to do localhost only still. We're still going to use it. And let's do the same on the other. Let's try that again. Now, under a task, when we have these tasks you can go out and tell it to resubmit a task. And that will tell it to resubmit. It puts it back into the queue of the same options and process. So that's just a quick way of trying to redeploy the task information. And we still have an error. So let me check and see what this error, and I'll be right back. Okay, and my bad. I believe this is related to all files. So the very, very first push, if I recall correctly now, is that we need to deploy all files so that it deploys the RNDC key that we had configured with this system. So we're going to try that again, and if that doesn't work, I'll break again and we'll start there. But this is, again, maybe something that you may miss, or I missed, of course, but some typical things that'll show up there. Let's hope we get past a little further here. Now, you can also view these logs. Let me see which server we're talking to. We're talking to 4. Let's see if this finishes here first. All right, so that was what that was. So again, I apologize for that quick temperamental thing there. So under on the system itself, let's go ahead and talk about logs real quick. The daemon log for DHCP is var/var/log/daemon.log, daemon log. When it starts up DHCP and DNS, all of that information gets written to those files. So you can tailf, you can see all of the information there. That should give you a good indication of what's happening. Under the IPControl log directory, you have the agent.log, which is all of that detail where we deployed, where that information is logged. You can see the interaction. We could go back and look at what the specific errors were and other details here as well. But this is also where we have all of our different logs for the queries. So if we take a look at like the DNS X4N log, you might now see the zone transfers that we expected for this server. And in that regard, we should then be allowed to go out and query this, which will just show us all the root servers initially, and then we can do evaldom.com. It'll give us the SOA, and then we could further, query for. These are very long names. I apologize for that here too. And you'll see here that I can do the DNS lookup for the names, etc. So again, very long video. However, I think we've gone through the steps. We have the DNS, did some very basic troubleshooting, but in all regards, everything is now deployed. We got some basic DNS, basic DHCP. In the next video, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about dynamic DNS, setting up the captures of that, the kind of tweaks for the DNS notifies and how we interact with it. And then maybe we'll go down to architecture and containers and others. So join me again if you can stand the, the narration here, and I'll see you shortly. Take care.